The dusty streets of Copper Ridge had seen their share of trouble, but nothing quite like the tension that gripped the town square on that sweltering Tuesday morning. Sheriff Marcus Dalton stood rigid, his weathered hand hovering near his Colt as he faced a group of 7 Apache warriors who had ridden into town at dawn. Their leader, a man with silver streaks in his long black hair and eyes that held the weight of countless battles, sat motionless on his painted horse, speaking in rapid Apache to his companions. The townspeople had gathered in clusters behind storefronts and around corners, their whispered conversations creating a low hum of anxiety that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Children pressed their faces against dusty windows, while their mothers pulled them back into the shadows. The men fingered their weapons nervously, waiting for someone to make the first move that could either bring peace or unleash hell upon their small frontier community. Sheriff Dalton had been lawman in Copper Ridge for 8 years, and he prided himself on being able to handle any situation with a combination of firm authority and measured diplomacy. But as the Apache leader continued speaking in his native tongue, gesturing toward the mountains beyond the town, Dalton felt a helplessness he hadn't experienced since his early days wearing the badge. Every word was foreign, every gesture could mean the difference between negotiation and bloodshed, and he found himself completely unable to bridge the communication gap that stretched between two worlds. Before we continue with this incredible story of courage and understanding, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support means everything to us as we bring these amazing tales from the Old West to life. The Apache leader's voice grew more urgent, and Dalton noticed the way the man's companions shifted in their saddles, their hands moving closer to their weapons. Time was running out, and the sheriff knew that his next decision could determine whether Copper Ridge would see another sunset in peace. He had dealt with Apache raids before, but always through the barrel of a gun or the swift pursuit of a posse. This was different. These men had come to talk, not to fight, but without a translator, their words might as well have been carried away by the desert wind. It was then that a voice, clear and confident, cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Sheriff Dalton, I believe I can help you." The voice belonged to a woman who stepped forward from the crowd, with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly in the harsh frontier setting. She was perhaps 35 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun, and wearing a plain brown dress that spoke of practicality rather than fashion. But it was her eyes that caught everyone's attention. They held a depth of experience that seemed far beyond her years, and a calmness that stood in stark contrast to the fear radiating from the gathered townspeople. Margaret O'Sullivan had arrived in Copper Ridge 3 months earlier, taking a position as the town's schoolteacher, after the previous educator had fled following an Apache raid on a nearby ranch. She kept to herself, mostly, living in a small room above the general store and spending her evenings reading by lamplight. The townspeople knew little about her past, only that she had come from somewhere back east, and that she possessed an education that was rare in their frontier community. What they didn't know was that Margaret carried secrets that would have shocked them to their very core. As she approached the sheriff, Margaret's mind raced back to her years at the Mission San Carlos, where she had served as Sister Mary Catherine for nearly a decade. The mission had been located in Apache territory, and she had spent countless hours learning their language and customs, believing that understanding was the first step toward bringing them into the Christian fold. She had been young then, filled with religious fervor and the certainty that her calling was to serve God by converting the native peoples. But life had taught her that faith and reality often walked very different paths. The Apache leader's eyes fixed on Margaret as she drew closer, and she could see a flicker of recognition in his weathered features. Not recognition of her personally, but of something familiar in her bearing, in the way she moved without fear or aggression. She stopped a respectful distance from his horse and spoke in fluent Apache, her voice carrying the proper intonations and respect that the language demanded. "Great warrior, I am called Margaret by the white people, but I once lived among those who served the Great Spirit in the mission to the south. I offer my words as a bridge between your people and ours." The transformation in the Apache leader's demeanor was immediate and profound. His rigid posture relaxed slightly, and he dismounted from his horse with fluid grace, approaching Margaret with the measured steps of a man who had found something unexpected and valuable. He spoke to her in Apache, his words flowing like water over stones, and Margaret listened intently, nodding occasionally and asking clarifying questions in his own language. The crowd watched in amazement as this woman, who had seemed like just another Eastern schoolmarm, demonstrated a mastery of the Apache tongue that none of them had imagined possible. Sheriff Dalton felt a mixture of relief and curiosity wash over him as he watched Margaret converse with the Apache leader. Her presence had already diffused much of the immediate tension, but he found himself wondering about this mysterious woman who had appeared in his town with such unexpected skills. As the conversation between Margaret and the Apache continued, he noticed how the other warriors had also relaxed, some even dismounting and allowing their horses to drink from the town's water trough. Margaret turned to face the sheriff, her expression serious but no longer tense with the immediate threat of violence. "Sheriff, this is Chief Running Bear of the Mescalero Apache. He and his men have come to Copper Ridge not to make war, but to seek justice for a great wrong that has been done to his people. 3 days ago, a group of white men attacked their winter camp, killing 2 women and stealing horses that belonged to the tribe. The raiders wore badges, and Chief Running Bear believes they may have been lawmen from this area." The words hit Sheriff Dalton like a physical blow. He knew immediately which incident Chief Running Bear was referring to. Deputy Tom Morrison and 3 other men had returned to town 3 days earlier with a string of horses, claiming they had recovered them from Apache horse thieves. Morrison had been insistent that they had acted within the law, pursuing stolen property and defending themselves when attacked. But now, hearing the Apache side of the story through Margaret's translation, Dalton began to see the incident in a very different light. Chief Running Bear continued speaking, and Margaret translated his words with careful precision. "He says that the horses were not stolen. They were gifts given to his people by Mexican traders in exchange for safe passage through Apache lands. The women who were killed were gathering medicinal plants near the stream when the white men attacked without warning. Chief Running Bear has come here not for revenge, but because he believes that true justice can only be achieved when both sides speak the truth." The crowd had grown larger as word spread through the town that something unprecedented was happening in the square. Margaret could feel their eyes upon her, could sense their curiosity and suspicion about her ability to communicate with the Apache. She had known this moment would come eventually, the moment when her past would collide with her present, when the secrets she had carried would be forced into the light. But she had not expected it to happen in such a public and dramatic fashion. As Chief Running Bear spoke again, his voice taking on a tone of deep sadness, Margaret felt her own emotions stirring in response to his words. She had spent years among people who had been displaced and marginalized, had seen firsthand the devastating effects of cultural misunderstanding and prejudice. When she translated his next words to Sheriff Dalton, her voice carried some of that emotion. "He says that his people have tried to live in peace with the white settlers, but that peace requires understanding and respect from both sides. He asks if the white man's law applies equally to all people or only to those with white skin." Sheriff Dalton found himself facing a moral and legal dilemma that went far beyond anything he had encountered in his years as a lawman. If Chief Running Bear's account was accurate, then Deputy Morrison and his companions had committed murder and theft while claiming to act under the authority of the law. But Morrison was not just any deputy. He was the nephew of the town's most influential businessman, and his version of events had already been accepted by many of the townspeople as fact. Margaret watched the sheriff's internal struggle play out across his weathered features, and she recognized the weight of the decision he was being forced to make. In her years at the mission, she had seen many men of authority faced with similar choices, the choice between what was easy and what was right, between maintaining the status quo and seeking true justice. She had also seen how those choices shaped not just individual lives, but entire communities. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the heat was beginning to make everyone uncomfortable, but no one seemed willing to leave the square while this unprecedented drama unfolded. Margaret suggested to Chief Running Bear that they might continue their discussion in the shade of the courthouse, and he agreed, understanding that the white man's customs required certain formalities to be observed. As they moved toward the building, Margaret found herself walking between 2 worlds, serving as more than just a translator, but as a bridge between vastly different ways of understanding justice and truth. Inside the courthouse, Sheriff Dalton called for Deputy Morrison to join them, and Margaret watched carefully as the young man entered the room. She had learned during her years at the mission to read the subtle signs of deception and guilt, and she saw both in Morrison's nervous glances and defensive posture. When Chief Running Bear began to recount his version of events, Morrison's face grew red with anger and indignation, but Margaret noticed that he never looked directly at the Apache leader while the story was being told. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Copper Ridge had ever witnessed. Through Margaret's careful translation, Chief Running Bear presented his case with the dignity and eloquence of a natural orator, describing not just the facts of the incident, but the broader context of Apache-white relations and the importance of justice in maintaining peace between their peoples. Morrison's responses, by contrast, were filled with bluster and racial epithets that Margaret found herself reluctant to translate directly, instead conveying the essence of his denials while softening their most offensive elements. As the hours passed, Margaret began to see a pattern emerging in Morrison's story, small inconsistencies and contradictions that suggested he was not telling the complete truth. When she pointed these out to Sheriff Dalton, she could see the doubt beginning to creep into his eyes. The sheriff was an honest man, and the possibility that one of his own deputies had committed such crimes while wearing a badge was deeply troubling to him. The turning point came when Chief Running Bear produced a piece of evidence that Morrison had not expected, a silver badge that had been dropped during the attack, bearing the distinctive markings of the Copper Ridge Sheriff's Department. Morrison's face went pale when he saw it, and his protests became even more vehement and less convincing. Margaret translated Chief Running Bear's words as he explained how one of his warriors had found the badge near the bodies of the slain women and how they had brought it as proof of who had committed the crime. Sheriff Dalton examined the badge carefully, recognizing it as one that had been issued to Morrison just 6 months earlier. The evidence was damning, but he knew that accepting it would mean acknowledging that his own department had been responsible for an unprovoked attack on innocent people. The political and social ramifications would be enormous, potentially destroying his career and dividing the town along racial lines that were already dangerously strained. Margaret watched the sheriff struggle with his decision, and she found herself thinking about her own journey from the certainty of religious faith to the more complex understanding of moral truth that she had developed over the years. She had left the mission not because she had lost her faith in God, but because she had come to believe that true service to the divine required a willingness to stand up for justice, even when it was difficult or unpopular. As the afternoon wore on, more evidence emerged that supported Chief Running Bear's account of events. Other townspeople came forward with information about Morrison's recent behavior, including his sudden acquisition of expensive new possessions and his boastful talk about teaching the Apaches a lesson. Margaret translated each piece of testimony, watching as the case against Morrison grew stronger and his position became increasingly untenable. The climax of the confrontation came when Morrison, realizing that his lies were being exposed, made a desperate attempt to turn the situation to his advantage. He accused Margaret of being an Apache sympathizer and suggested that her translations could not be trusted because of her obvious bias in favor of the Indians. His words struck at the heart of the townspeople's suspicions about this mysterious woman who had appeared among them with such unusual skills and knowledge. Margaret felt the weight of the crowd's scrutiny as Morrison's accusations hung in the air. She knew that her response to this challenge would determine not just the outcome of this particular case, but her own future in Copper Ridge. For a moment, she was transported back to the mission, remembering the day she had made the decision to leave religious life behind and venture into the uncertain world beyond the convent walls. Standing in that courthouse, with the eyes of both white settlers and Apache warriors upon her, Margaret made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She spoke first in English, addressing the crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness this unprecedented event. "I came to Copper Ridge to teach your children, to help build a community based on knowledge and understanding, rather than fear and prejudice. I have served as translator today not because I favor one side over another, but because I believe that truth and justice require that all voices be heard and understood." Then she turned to Chief Running Bear and spoke in Apache, her words carrying the weight of personal conviction and moral authority. She told him that she understood the pain his people had suffered, and that she would continue to serve as his voice in the white man's world for as long as justice required it. Her fluency and obvious respect for Apache culture made it clear to everyone present that her knowledge was not superficial or recently acquired. but deep and genuine. Sheriff Dalton found himself facing a moment of truth that would test everything he believed about law, justice, and moral courage. The evidence against Morrison was overwhelming, and Margaret's translations had been consistent and credible throughout the long day of testimony. But arresting his own deputy for murder would require him to acknowledge that the badge he wore could be used as a shield for criminal behavior, and that the system he had sworn to uphold was capable of terrible injustice. In the end, it was Margaret's quiet strength and unwavering commitment to truth that gave Sheriff Dalton the courage to do what was right. He placed Morrison under arrest for the murder of 2 Apache women and the theft of tribal property, making it clear that the law would apply equally to all people regardless of their race or position. The decision sent shockwaves through the community, but it also established a precedent that would shape relations between Copper Ridge and the surrounding Apache tribes for years to come. Chief Running Bear's response to the sheriff's decision was one of dignified gratitude rather than triumphant vindication. Through Margaret's translation, he expressed his appreciation for the white man's willingness to seek justice even when it was difficult, and he offered his hand in friendship to Sheriff Dalton as a symbol of the peace that could exist between their peoples when mutual respect and understanding prevailed. As the formal proceedings concluded, and the Apache warriors prepared to return to their homeland, Chief Running Bear approached Margaret with words that she would treasure for the rest of her life. He told her that she possessed the rare gift of being able to walk between worlds without losing her soul, and that her willingness to serve as a bridge between peoples made her a valuable ally in the ongoing struggle for peace and understanding. The townspeople watched in amazement as Margaret conversed easily with the Apache leader, many of them seeing her in an entirely new light. The mysterious schoolteacher, who had kept to herself for 3 months, had revealed herself to be a woman of extraordinary courage and capability, someone who possessed skills and knowledge that could benefit their entire community in ways they were only beginning to understand. As the Apache riders disappeared into the desert landscape from which they had emerged, Margaret found herself surrounded by curious townspeople eager to learn more about her background and her remarkable linguistic abilities. She answered their questions with the same quiet dignity she had displayed throughout the day, explaining that she had learned Apache during her years of service at a mission in the territory, but offering few details about the personal journey that had brought her to Copper Ridge. Sheriff Dalton approached Margaret as the crowd began to disperse, his expression reflecting both gratitude and curiosity. He thanked her for her crucial role in preventing what could have been a tragic misunderstanding, and he asked if she would be willing to serve as an official translator for the sheriff's department in future dealings with the Apache tribes. Margaret accepted the position, understanding that it would give her an opportunity to continue building bridges between the two communities. In the days that followed, word of the events in Copper Ridge spread throughout the territory, carried by travelers and traders who had witnessed or heard about the unprecedented peaceful resolution of what could have been a violent confrontation. Margaret found herself becoming something of a local celebrity, though she remained characteristically modest about her role in the proceedings. The trial of Deputy Morrison became a landmark case in territorial law, establishing important precedents about the equal application of justice regardless of race. Margaret served as the primary translator throughout the proceedings, ensuring that Apache witnesses could tell their stories in their own words and that the white jury could understand the full impact of Morrison's crimes on the tribal community. Morrison was ultimately convicted and sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, a verdict that sent a clear message about the consequences of using official authority to commit crimes against any people, regardless of their race or social status. The conviction was controversial among some segments of the white community, but it was also praised by progressive voices who saw it as an important step toward true equality under the law. For Margaret, the trial represented both an ending and a beginning. The secrets of her past had been partially revealed, but she had found a new purpose in her role as a bridge between communities. She continued teaching school in Copper Ridge, but she also began working with both Apache and white leaders to develop better communication and understanding between their peoples. Chief Running Bear kept his word about maintaining peace with Copper Ridge, and over the following months, a tentative but growing relationship developed between the town and the surrounding Apache communities. Trade relationships were established, and Margaret often served as a facilitator in these negotiations, helping both sides understand each other's needs and concerns. The transformation in Margaret's own life was equally profound. She had found a way to serve others that drew upon all of her experiences, her religious training, her linguistic skills, and her deep understanding of human nature. She had also discovered that leaving the convent had not meant abandoning her calling, but rather expanding it to encompass a broader vision of service and justice. As autumn arrived in Copper Ridge, Margaret reflected on the remarkable chain of events that had brought her to this point in her life. She had come to the frontier town seeking anonymity and a fresh start, but instead she had found herself at the center of a historic moment that would be remembered for generations. The former nun who had once sought to convert the Apache to Christianity had instead become an advocate for their rights and dignity within the white man's world. The relationship between Margaret and Sheriff Dalton had also evolved over the months following the Morrison trial. What had begun as professional cooperation had grown into mutual respect and friendship, and there were signs that it might develop into something deeper. Both were cautious people who had been shaped by difficult experiences, but they had found in each other a shared commitment to justice and truth that provided a strong foundation for whatever the future might bring. The children in Margaret's classroom had also benefited from their teachers' unique experiences and perspectives. She incorporated lessons about Apache culture and history into her curriculum, helping to create a generation of young people who would grow up with a more nuanced understanding of the diverse communities that shared the frontier landscape. Her students learned not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also tolerance, empathy, and the importance of seeking to understand those who were different from themselves. As winter approached, Margaret received a letter that would once again change the course of her life. It came from the territorial governor, who had heard about her role in the Morrison case and her work in improving relations between white settlers and Apache tribes. The governor was forming a commission to develop policies for peaceful coexistence between different cultural groups in the territory, and he wanted Margaret to serve as the commission's chief cultural liaison and translator. The offer represented an opportunity to expand her work beyond Copper Ridge and to influence territorial policy at the highest levels. It would mean leaving the quiet life she had built as a school teacher, but it would also allow her to serve the cause of justice and understanding on a much larger scale. Margaret spent many evenings walking the dusty streets of Copper Ridge, weighing the decision and considering what path would best serve the principles she had come to hold dear. In the end, it was Chief Running Bear who helped her make the decision. He visited Copper Ridge one final time before the winter snows made travel difficult, and he spoke with Margaret about the importance of her work and the opportunities that lay ahead. Through their conversation, she came to understand that her calling was not to remain in one place, but to go wherever her unique skills and experiences could do the most good. Margaret accepted the governor's offer, but she negotiated terms that would allow her to maintain her connection to Copper Ridge and to continue her work with the Apache tribes in the region. She would spend part of each year traveling throughout the territory, working with different communities to build understanding and resolve conflicts, but she would always return to the town that had become her home and to the people who had accepted her despite her mysterious past. On her last day as Copper Ridge's schoolteacher, Margaret stood before her students and delivered a farewell address that many of them would remember for the rest of their lives. She spoke about the importance of courage in the face of injustice, about the value of understanding different perspectives, and about the power that each individual possessed to make a positive difference in the world. Her words carried the weight of personal experience and the authority of someone who had lived according to the principles she espoused. Sheriff Dalton was among those who gathered to see Margaret off as she began her new role with the Territorial Commission. Their goodbye was both professional and personal, reflecting the complex relationship that had developed between them over the months since that fateful day in the town square. Both understood that their paths would continue to cross in the years ahead, and both looked forward to the opportunities for continued collaboration in the cause of justice and peace. As Margaret's stagecoach pulled away from Copper Ridge, she looked back at the town that had given her a second chance and a new purpose in life. The former nun who had once sought to save souls through religious conversion had instead found salvation through service to justice and understanding. She had learned that true faith was not about converting others to your beliefs, but about having the courage to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult or unpopular. The story of Margaret O'Sullivan, and her role in the Morrison case became part of the folklore of the American frontier, passed down through generations as an example of how one person's courage and integrity could change the course of history. But for Margaret herself, it was simply the beginning of a new chapter in a life dedicated to building bridges between different worlds and different peoples. Years later, when historians would write about the development of more enlightened policies toward Native American tribes in the Southwestern Territories, they would often point to the Morrison case as a turning point. But they would also note that the real hero of the story was not the sheriff who made the arrest or the judge who handed down the sentence, but the former nun who had the courage to speak truth in two languages and to stand as a bridge between worlds that had too often been at war. Margaret O'Sullivan had found her true calling not in the quiet contemplation of convent life, but in the messy, complicated, and often dangerous work of seeking justice in an unjust world. She had learned that sometimes the greatest service to God and humanity came not from prayer and meditation, but from the willingness to step forward when others remained silent, to speak when others would not listen, and to build bridges where others saw only walls. The former nun who had once sought to bring the Apache into the Christian fold had instead brought justice to a frontier town, understanding to a divided community, and hope to all those who believed that different peoples could live together in peace and mutual respect. Her story became a testament to the power of courage, the importance of truth, and the possibility of redemption for all those willing to serve something greater than themselves.